I'll tell you what else isn't going to run the way it used to, and that is, well, for the most part democratically, is ECan, Environment Canterbury. Legislation passed this week, I think Wednesday night in Parliament, means that ECan, as it's known, will have two Ngāi Tahu, that is the South Island iwi, in case you didn't know, two Ngāi Tahu representatives on its board. I think 14 people in total on the board. The two new members will be, added to the 14 elected ECan members, taking the number of seats on ECan to 16. They won't be elected. They'll simply be appointed. All the rest of the 14 people on the ECan board are elected. They go through a democratic process. But for some reason, Parliament in this instance has decided to abandon the idea of democracy. One person, one vote, universal enfranchisement. And that has caused deep concern amongst some in Parliament, including the National Party's Justice spokesperson, Paul Goldsmith, who joins us on the line now. Paul, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. What's wrong with having a couple of Ngāi Tahu on ECan?
Well, look, I mean, the two basic principles that we're trying to defend equal voting rights for all New Zealanders. The basic notion of equal suffrage, which Kate Shepherd fought for 100 years ago for women to get the vote, and every person having an equal say in who governs them and who make decisions about their lives. So that has been changed by this bill, because everybody, including Māori, get to vote for 14 councillors, and then on top of that, Ngāi Tahu appoint two more. So that group have unequal voting rights. And then
I just want to hold you up there for a moment, Paul. National Party, very into democracy and everything. Weren't you the guys who kind of fired ECan last time it was democratically elected and put in a whole lot of commissioners?
Yeah, and that was...
Yeah, sorry, was that yes? Was that a yes?
Yeah, yes, we did.
Yeah,
we
okay,
did,
right.
Because Environment Canterbury was failing hopelessly, and so as per the law, the central government came in through them out and put in the commissioners for a temporary period to get things back on track. And we also included a representative from Ngāi Tahu. The big difference is, of course, they were government appointments done by an elected government that if people didn't like it, they could throw the government out, which, at the next election, funnily enough, or an election or two later, we were gone, not necessarily on one issue, but that's how democracy works. If you do something, you're accountable, you get thrown out. The issue here, of course, under this new arrangement is that Ngāi Tahu gets to appoint two councillors, and they could be the worst councillors in the history of the world, but they would never get thrown out.
All right, let me just clarify this. Who vests in Ngāi Tahu the power to appoint two councillors to ECan?
Well, it's the law, the government.
And what does the law say specifically? Does it say Ngāi Tahu?
Yes, it's the Te Rūnanga of Ngāi Tahu who gets to make the appointment. So,
Can I ask you, do we know if Ngāi Tahu is a democratic body?
They will claim they have processes in place to do that, but they're not sort of open and public or anything like that, and it's certainly not what we would describe as a democratic election.
All right. Okay, so Ngāi Tahu have forevermore, under the legislation passed on Wednesday, the right to appoint two of their people, representatives to ECan, and they have full voting rights?
Yes.
All right. It's still not a dominant position on ECan, though, is it? 14 others.
No. But I suppose it's the principle, and the principle is that it breaches those two basic ideas of equal voting rights and accountability at the ballot box.
Yeah.
And the problem that we have, of course, is not only is it this what's happening in Canterbury, it also, if you looked at Timothy Coffey, one of the Labour...
Yeah, he said this is the kind of opening of the gate for this to happen everywhere, didn't he, this week?
Yes,
and
yes,
I might note he would not come on and debate these issues with you this morning. I just want to make that clear as well. We did invite him.
Well, none of them really want to talk about it. And of course, also the other speeches by Labour MPs, even in the Canterbury context, were saying this is a step along the path. And presumably the path is, this idea of co-governance where they'd have half the seats. It would be the ultimate outcome. And so it's just a very different concept of democracy, and you hear they're quite blatant about it. Willie Jackson will say democracy has changed. They come up with all sorts of non-speak sort of words to say democracy has evolved or it has matured. But really, what they mean is it's gone from something that we've always understood to be equal voting rights for New Zealanders to something else.
Yeah, well, Paul, I was trying to look at how this might be acceptable, and it might be acceptable to me if people who identified as Ngāi Tahu weren't allowed to vote in the general ECan election, right?
Well, but that would be the normal way that we deal with it, of course, is through Maori seats, which the number of those Maori seats are proportional to the voting population, and so that maintains equal power for each vote. But they deliberately went against that model to an appointment one at a different kind of ratio where their votes have more power.
Who drove this legislation, Paul, to your understanding?
Well, it was Environment Canterbury that came up with the bill and asked for it, so that they drove it, no doubt. Presumably,
and they were elected representatives. So, isn't this in some ways, Paul, the embodiment, the expression of the views of elected representatives?
Well, the point is that a bunch of Environment Canterbury councillors, I don't think, should have the right to change the structure of our voting arrangements. And in their defence, they haven't. They've just put forward a bill. It was the Labour and Green parties that have passed this bill. And what I find irritating is that through this whole process, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice, and senior ministers have had nothing to say about it. They've right up until the end refused to answer any questions about it, saying, it's nothing to do with us, it's a local bill, not our problem, why are you asking me? But of course, it only happens if their party votes for it.
Yeah. I've got to tell you, we've got Reno Titakatni is coming on after 8 o'clock this morning to talk about it. So someone is fronting.
Yes, he's a good guy, but he is a backbench MP. He is not one of the cabinet and one of the people who are supposed to be making the case. And the point I'd make is, look, there may be perfectly, society might want to change away from equal voting rights.
Don't be naughty. You know that it doesn't. You know that it doesn't.
Well, no, of course it doesn't. But what should happen when you're changing the way our democracy works is the Prime Minister should say, I no longer believe that it's appropriate for everybody in Canterbury to have an equal say on who governs them because of X, Y, Z, and people can either agree with it or disagree with it. But she hasn't done that, and that is what I think is the biggest issue here, is the refusal to engage, the refusal to ask New Zealanders, and it certainly wasn't put forward in the 2020 election. You didn't see Jacinda Ardern in 2020 election saying, oh, by the way, I'm going to change the nature of our democracy and I'm going to move away from equal voting rights. She didn't make that case. It has no mandate, but they're slipping this sort of stuff through without talking about it.
Truth is, how many people bother voting? How many people would know ECan if they fell over it in the street? And how many people actually do vote for the members that are on there?
That's another issue, but we live in an imperfect world, unfortunately. But there you go. So that's a challenge for all local governments to get people enthusiastic about it. It affects people's lives enormously. But you're right, people are busy. Everybody's busy, and they've got things to worry about. They've got lunches to make for school, and they're not necessarily always thinking about what goes on in local government.
Yeah. All right, Paul. So naturally, we're national to take the Treasury benches next year. you will immediately void this legislation and turn the clock back?
Yes, that's been our commitment. We will repeal it because we don't think it's right to make significant sort of constitutional changes on a bare majority without consulting the broader public.
Well, I can guarantee you that Mr. Titikartini, when he comes on the program later this morning, is going to tell me that this sort of legislation or a move is in lockstep with the applications of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. So I'm going to ask you this morning, would National commit to going a step further and removing the amorphous principles of the treaty from any and all legislation in New Zealand? Would you get rid of the treaty, which seems to me to be a movable feast for radicals, from all our legislation and sort of directives to the public service?
No, we haven't made that commitment.
Why not? Why haven't you made that commitment?
Well, because it is part of our constitutional framework. But what we haven't decided as a country, and what I wouldn't decide, is that the treaty trumps democracy as we understand it, and that's where the issue is right here, right now, where the implication is the claim, or not even explicitly made, but sometimes made, is that the treaty somehow requires such things as direct appointments by Ngāi Tahu. And if it's by Ngāi Tahu, it would be by every other iwi right across the country, and we don't agree with that. And so that's the point I'm making today. We don't think it trumps democracy, and we will stand for the principles of equal voting rights and accountability.
All right. I still have to play devil's advocate to a certain extent and say part of this, and I know how part of this is often portrayed in other media, is that as the Indigenous or First Peoples of New Zealand, Māori have a greater understanding and affinity for the environment and a greater sense of stewardship and responsibility for the land of New Zealand than other people can, which is why we need their input in bodies like this, because they have a unique, almost spiritual perception that us non-Māori people can never possess.
Yes, well, I've never agreed with that. I think all New Zealanders have an equal love of this country. My family have been here for more than 180 years, and I don't think necessarily the amount of time you've been in the place necessarily changes the way that you view it.
So you would reject any premise that Māori, as a group or by iwi in particular locations, have any special spiritual or other relationship with the land and the environment?
Well, they certainly believe they do, and there's no.
Do you believe they do?
Well, look, there's lots of different sort of overlapping issues here. The point I would
that's a pretty straightforward question. There's nothing overlap. Do you believe, if some Māori believe they have a special connection with the land, they're almost spiritual? Do you believe that? Do you believe they're right when they think that?
Look, I can understand the concept of mana whenua, a group of people associated with a piece of land, and I've got no problem with that concept. What I do have a problem with is extending that to different voting rights, and that is the issue that we focus on here. Because if you take the step from a concept of mana whenua across a city, across a region, to that right conferring extra voting rights, then I have a real problem with the issue, because I actually think our democratic principles of people having an equal say in the country that they live in is more important and is something more precious than we give credit for, because it is one of the things that makes this country a great country to live in. And I look around the world and I can't find any countries where that are based on different voting rights for different kinds of citizens and non-accountability at the ballot box.
Well, we don't have to dress it up. This is on ethnicity. This is literally on your race, isn't it?
Yes, and so I can't see any countries in the world where that kind of division is successful. And so I just think that's why we're asserting that the principle of equal voting rights being something that we will stand up for and what we'll try and restore if we get elected this time next year.
Paul, you've been beating this drum since the story broke Wednesday night, since the legislation was passed. What sort of reaction?
I've been talking for a long time.
Yeah, what sort of reaction you've been getting?
Well, it's been hard work. I've been trying to point this out for a couple of months or longer, and it started with the Rotorua bill, which was a different kind of bill, but equally moved away from equal voting rights. And it's hard work. People. Has
Willie Jackson called you a racist yet? Has Matt Tukaki called you a racist yet, or not?
Oh, of course, on numerous occasions. And look, there's enormous interest in electoral laws when it comes to electoral finance, which is fair enough. So I get asked lots of questions about that, but there's far less interest in electoral laws when it comes to the broad principles of equal voting rights, and I find that frustrating. But a politician complaining about the media is like a farmer complaining about the weather. It's a pointless exercise, and you've got to do well under the conditions in which you operate. So
I know you're going to be heartened this morning to learn from me, in case you don't already know, though, that local body election issues like this are going to be covered impartially and fairly by the spin-off that's just got $168,000 from the Public Interest Journalism Fund simply for covering local body elections. Isn't that great news?
Well, it's a land of opportunity.
It sure is, if you're prepared to compromise your principles. Paul Goldsmith, thank you very much. Justice Spokesman for the National Party, thank you very much indeed for your time. So there you go. The Nats are going to roll back. They're going to roll back the 2 special seats for Ngāi Tahu on ECan, Environment Canterbury. And he has, though he was trying to be very careful so he didn't get accused of being a racist, which he hasn't anyway, so why worry? He says Māori don't have some special connection with the land. That means we've got to give them this. And what are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi? I'm more and more inclined to the view that Professor Elizabeth Rata, who is going to be on the platform, who gave a great speech at an ACT organised event, that we just need to go through all our legislation in this country and get rid of any reference to the Treaty of Waitangi. We need to create a truly functional 21st century democracy that isn't based on the idea that coming here before someone else gives you extra rights, or that your ethnicity somehow gives you a greater spiritual or, godlike connection with a piece of land. I really do.